The mercury in the glass tube read -38 degrees outside the cabin door. Inside the conventional trapper's shelter 20 yards away, where a fire had burned all night, the temperature held at -2 degrees. Inside the cabin built beneath the stone arch with the same fire burning, the mercury showed positive 42 degrees. 44 degrees of difference that would save lives and change how men built in the Montana wilderness forever. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1840 to 1841 brought cold to the Montana Territory that old trappers claimed they had never witnessed in their lifetimes. It arrived in mid-January without warning, a mass of Arctic air that descended from the Canadian plains and settled across the Rocky Mountain valleys like something solid and immovable. The temperature dropped to levels where spit froze before hitting the ground, where breath formed ice crystals in beards, where exposed skin blackened with frostbite in minutes. Henrik Stromberg stood outside his cabin on the morning of January 19, 1841, watching smoke rise from William Porter's chimney 300 yards down the valley. The smoke climbed straight up in the still air, a thin gray column that spoke of a fire burning inside. Henrik knew William was burning every piece of firewood he had cut for the month, trying desperately to keep his family warm. Henrik also knew, with the certainty that came from 6 years of observation and measurement, that William's fire was barely making a difference. Henrik's own cabin sat beneath a massive stone arch, a geological formation that towered 40 feet above the valley floor and extended back into the hillside like a frozen wave of granite. The cabin itself was unremarkable, built from local pine logs in the standard notched corner method that every trapper in the territory used. But its location, tucked completely underneath the overhanging stone, made it fundamentally different from every other structure in the region. The idea had come to him in the spring of 1835, 6 years earlier, born from tragedy and transformed by obsession into something that other trappers still mocked as foolishness. They called it Stromberg's Cave. They joked that he lived like a bear, hiding under rocks instead of building in honest clearings like proper men. They questioned whether the stone might collapse and crush him in his sleep. They suggested, with the casual cruelty that isolated men often wielded, that grief had damaged his mind. Henrik had stopped trying to explain his reasoning years ago. The numbers spoke for themselves, recorded meticulously in a journal he kept by his bed. Temperature measurements taken with a mercury thermometer he had purchased in St. Louis. Readings recorded 3 times daily for 5 winters. The pattern was undeniable. On cold nights, his cabin remained dramatically warmer than conventional structures, even when comparable fires burned in both. On the coldest nights, the difference became extreme. This morning, January 19th, would provide the most extreme demonstration yet. Henrik walked the 20 yards to William Porter's cabin, his feet crunching on snow that had the consistency of sand in the brutal cold. He knocked on the door, his knuckles protected by thick moose-hide mittens. William opened it, his face haggard from a sleepless night spent feeding his fire. "Come measure if you want," William said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "The children are alive." "Barely." Henrik stepped inside with his thermometer. Henrik Stromberg arrived in the Montana Territory in the spring of 1834 with 2 pack mules, a rifle, basic trapping supplies, and the skills his father had taught him in their Minnesota logging camp. He was 26 years old, unmarried, and drawn west by the same combination of ambition and restlessness that brought most young men to the frontier. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was past its peak by then, but a competent trapper could still make decent money if he worked hard and survived. He met William Porter at a trading post on the Yellowstone River in late April. William was 32, married to a woman named Catherine, and father to 2 children, ages 5 and 3. They had come from Ohio the previous year and built a cabin in a valley about 40 miles southwest of the trading post. William knew the mountains and offered to show Henrik good trapping territory in exchange for help improving his cabin before winter. Henrik agreed. The partnership made practical sense. William had local knowledge and an established base camp. Henrik had strong arms and construction experience. They spent May and June working William's trap lines, learning each other's rhythms and capabilities. The work was profitable enough. Beaver were scarce compared to earlier decades, but marten, fox, and muskrat brought fair prices. In July, they turned their attention to William's cabin. It was typical frontier construction, built the previous summer in 4 days of hard work. Logs notched at the corners chinked with moss and mud, a dirt floor, one small window covered with oiled paper, and a simple pole and bark roof. The structure kept out wind and rain adequately, but William wanted improvements before his family faced another Montana winter. Henrik helped him build a proper stone fireplace to replace the open fire pit William had used the first year. They dug clay from a creek bank and gathered flat stones from a nearby hillside. The work took 2 weeks. The fireplace drew well and reflected heat into the room, a significant improvement over the open pit. They also built sleeping platforms for the children, raising them off the cold earth floor. By August, Henrik had scouted his own location and begun building his cabin 3 miles up the valley from William's place. He chose a standard clearing near a creek, following conventional wisdom about cabin placement. Water access was important. The site was level. Large pines nearby would provide firewood. He built using the same methods William had used, the same methods every trapper in the territory used. The work went quickly with William's help. The cabin was finished by early September. Henrik and William worked their trap lines through the fall, checking each other's sets and sharing the work of processing pelts. When winter came, Henrik learned what Montana cold meant. His cabin, for all its solid construction, felt barely warmer inside than the air outside when the temperature dropped. He burned wood constantly and still woke to frost on the interior walls. It was survivable, but deeply uncomfortable. He assumed this was simply how winter worked in the mountains. The extreme cold arrived on February 7, 1835, without warning or gradual descent. Henrik woke that morning to temperatures that felt different from ordinary winter cold, something deeper and more threatening. The air itself seemed brittle. His breath hung in clouds that barely dispersed. The creek near his cabin, which usually ran all winter, had frozen completely solid. He checked his trap lines quickly, knowing that lingering outdoors in such conditions was dangerous. By midday, he had returned to his cabin and built up his fire, burning wood at a rate that would deplete his supply rapidly if the cold persisted. Inside, with the fire roaring, the temperature felt barely tolerable. He kept his coat on. His water bucket formed ice around the edges despite sitting 5 feet from the fireplace. On February 9th, the cold intensified further. Henrik had never experienced anything like it. The logs of his cabin contracted with sharp cracking sounds. The chinking between logs seemed to shrink, opening gaps that let in drafts of air so cold they burned exposed skin. He fed his fire continuously, but the heat seemed to vanish upward through the roof, disappearing into the frozen sky above. That evening, he heard gunshots from the direction of William's cabin. 3 shots in rapid succession, then silence. It was not the pattern of hunting. It was a signal. Henrik, dressed in every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped his face in wool, and made the 3-mile trek through snow that crunched like broken glass under his boots. He found William standing outside his cabin, his face gray with shock and grief. Catherine was inside with the children. The youngest, a daughter named Anna, who had just turned 3, had died sometime during the previous night. The older boy, Thomas, was alive but barely responsive, his skin pale and cold to the touch despite lying next to his mother under every blanket the family owned. The fireplace still held burning logs. The cabin was not warm, but it was not freezing. Yet Anna had died of cold inside a structure with a fire burning. Henrik could not process this reality. He helped William wrap Anna's small body in a blanket. They could not bury her. The ground was frozen solid. They placed her in the small storage shed behind the cabin, where the cold would preserve her until spring. Catherine held Thomas close to the fire. The boy's breathing was shallow and labored. Henrik and William fed more wood into the fireplace, building the fire as large as the chimney would support. The flames roared, consuming wood at an unsustainable rate. The heat reached perhaps 6 feet from the fireplace, then dissipated into the cold air that filled the rest of the cabin. Thomas died just after midnight on February 10th. His breathing simply stopped. Catherine made no sound. William sat on the floor and stared at the fire that had failed to save his children. Henrik stayed with William and Catherine for 3 days after the children died. The extreme cold persisted, though it moderated slightly by February 12th. They kept the fire burning constantly, less for warmth now than for something to do, some action that felt purposeful in the face of incomprehensible loss. Catherine barely spoke. William moved through the cabin like a man under water, his actions slow and disconnected from intention. On the 4th day, Henrik returned to his own cabin. The temperature had risen enough that travel was merely dangerous instead of suicidal. His fire had died during his absence, and the interior of his cabin had frozen to match the outside air. It took him 6 hours to get the space warm enough to remove his outer layers of clothing. He understood with absolute clarity that if the cold had lasted 1 more week, he might have died the same way William's children had died. The question consumed him. Why had they frozen with a fire burning? He had watched William's fire roar in the fireplace, producing heat he could feel from 6 feet away. Yet the cabin had remained lethally cold. The children had been wrapped in blankets, lying near the fire. It should have been enough. By all reasonable expectations, it should have been enough. Henrik began paying attention to his own cabin with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He noticed how heat from his fireplace seemed to rise directly to the roof and disappear. He observed that the area near the fire was warm, but 10 feet away, the temperature dropped dramatically. He realized that the logs of his walls, despite being chinked with mud and moss, leaked cold air through dozens of tiny gaps that became visible when he held a candle near the chinking and watched the flame flicker. He visited other trappers' cabins over the following weeks as the weather moderated into more typical late winter conditions. He saw the same patterns everywhere: fireplaces that heated small areas while the rest of the cabin remained cold, roofs that seemed to function as chimneys for warmth pulling heat upward and releasing it into the sky, walls that leaked air despite appearing solid. Every cabin in the territory was fundamentally similar, built using methods passed down without question because they worked well enough in most conditions. But well enough was not sufficient when extreme cold arrived. Henrik had seen the proof of that in William's cabin. 2 children dead, not from lack of fire or fuel or effort, but from some fundamental flaw in how the structures were built. The heat was going somewhere. It was being lost through mechanisms that Henrik did not fully understand but could clearly observe. He started reading everything he could find about heat and building construction. The trading post had few books, but Henrik found a volume on architecture that a previous trader had left behind. The text discussed principles of heat retention, insulation, and thermal mass. Most of it was written for formal buildings in cities, but the underlying concepts were universal. Spring arrived in late March, bringing temperatures that felt warm after the brutal winter. Henrik returned to his trap lines, working mechanically through tasks that had lost their meaning. William and Catherine had left the territory in early March, unable to remain in the cabin where their children had died. They traveled east back to Ohio, leaving behind their cabin and everything associated with Montana. Henrik never saw them again. He worked alone through April and May, checking traps and processing pelts with the efficiency of long practice. The work took him far from his cabin, following creek drainages and ridge lines into areas he had not previously explored. On May 14, 1835, he was tracking a creek that ran through a narrow valley about 8 miles from his cabin when he noticed an unusual geological formation on the north-facing slope. A massive stone arch extended from the hillside, creating an overhang that projected outward like a frozen wave. The formation was enormous, perhaps 60 feet wide and extending 40 feet out from the main hillside. The underside of the arch created a sheltered space, a natural alcove protected from rain and snow. Henrik had seen similar formations elsewhere in the mountains, but something about this one caught his attention. He approached the arch and stepped into the sheltered space beneath it. The difference was immediate and striking. Outside, in the open air, a cool breeze blew down the valley, typical for May in the mountains. Beneath the arch, the air was noticeably warmer and completely still. Henrik stood there for several minutes, processing the sensation. The stone above him had absorbed heat from the sun during the day. Now, even though the sun had moved behind the ridge and the valley was in shadow, the stone was radiating that stored heat downward into the sheltered space. He touched the underside of the arch. The stone was warm to his hand, holding heat like the bricks of a fireplace hold warmth after the fire dies. The realization formed slowly. Stone absorbed heat. Stone held heat. Stone released heat gradually over time. He had known these facts intellectually, but standing beneath the arch, feeling the warmth radiating from tons of granite overhead, the implications became concrete and immediate. Henrik returned to the arch 3 days later with his thermometer. He took measurements in the open air, then measurements beneath the arch. The temperature differential was modest in May, perhaps 5 degrees warmer beneath the stone than in the open air. But May was mild. What would the differential be in winter, when the stone could absorb heat from below, from a fire burning in a cabin built beneath the arch? He began visiting the arch regularly, sometimes camping there overnight. He observed how the space beneath the stone remained dry during rainstorms. He noticed how wind that howled down the valley barely penetrated the sheltered area. He studied the angles of the arch, estimating how large a structure could fit beneath it. The space was constrained, certainly, but adequate for a small cabin. A man could build here if he chose. The idea seemed absurd at first. Trappers built in clearings near water, in open spaces where construction was easy and sight lines were clear. Building beneath a stone arch would be difficult, confined, unconventional. Other trappers would consider it strange, possibly mad, but Henrik kept returning to the fundamental question that had obsessed him since February. How do you keep heat inside a cabin during extreme cold? Henrik spent June and July of 1835 studying the stone arch with systematic intensity. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. He had attended school through 8th grade in Minnesota before joining his father's logging crew at age 14. But his father had taught him to observe carefully, measure precisely, and think through problems methodically. Henrik applied these skills to understanding the thermal properties of the geological formation. He built a small fire beneath the arch one evening in late June and watched what happened to the heat. The smoke rose and spread out against the underside of the stone, then drifted out from beneath the arch in a slow dispersal pattern. The stone itself absorbed heat from the smoke and flames. Henrik could feel the rock warming as the fire burned. Hours after he let the fire die, the stone continued, radiating warmth downward into the space below. He took temperature measurements compulsively. Outside air temperature at dawn, 48 degrees. Temperature beneath the arch at the same time, 54 degrees. Outside air temperature at midday with sun directly overhead, 67 degrees. Temperature beneath the arch, 62 degrees. The stone moderated temperature swings, absorbing excess heat during warm hours and releasing it during cool hours. The effect created a more stable, thermal environment than existed in open air. Henrik began calculating. The arch extended approximately 40 feet from the hillside and was roughly 60 feet wide. The height varied, but at its lowest point along the outer edge, the stone was still 12 feet above the ground. A cabin built entirely beneath this arch could be perhaps 30 feet deep, 20 feet wide, and 8 feet tall at its peak. Those dimensions would provide adequate living space for one man, more than adequate compared to his current cabin. The critical insight came in mid-July during a week of hot weather. Daytime temperatures climbed into the 80s, unusual for the Montana mountains, but not unprecedented. Henrik's current cabin, built in an open clearing, became uncomfortably hot during the afternoon as sun pounded the roof and walls. He spent an afternoon beneath the stone arch and found the space noticeably cooler than the surrounding air. The massive stone formation blocked direct sunlight and absorbed heat slowly enough that the sheltered area remained comfortable even during the hottest part of the day. The principle worked in both directions. Stone that kept the space cool in summer would keep it warm in winter. A fire burning inside a cabin beneath the arch would heat not just the interior air, but also the stone overhead. That heated stone would become a thermal battery, storing warmth and radiating it back into the living space for hours after the fire died or diminished. The stone would also prevent heat from escaping upward, the primary heat loss mechanism Henrik had observed in conventional cabins. He spent 3 days sketching plans in a notebook, working out dimensions and angles. The cabin would need to fit entirely beneath the arch, positioned to maximize the stone overhang. The back wall would integrate with the hillside, possibly even set into it slightly for additional protection. The front wall would face the valley, allowing light and air while remaining sheltered by the arch's projection. The roof would be minimal, perhaps just planks to create a ceiling, since the stone overhead eliminated the need for weather protection from above. August of 1835 brought Henrik to detailed planning that consumed his evenings and occupied his thoughts during the day. He continued working his trap lines mechanically, but his mind was always calculating angles, estimating materials, solving construction problems that conventional cabin building never addressed. Building beneath a stone arch presented challenges that no trapper in the territory had previously confronted. The foundation concerned him most. The ground beneath the arch sloped slightly from back to front, following the natural grade of the hillside. A conventional cabin could tolerate slight floor slope, but Henrik wanted precision. He decided to excavate the interior space, removing soil, until he reached bedrock or solid substrate, then build up a level floor using carefully selected stones. The work would be exhausting, but it would create a stable base that would not settle or shift. The walls presented their own complexities. The back wall would need to integrate with the hillside, requiring careful fitting against irregular stone surfaces. The side walls would extend from the hillside forward, following the natural contours of the arch overhead. The front wall would be the only fully conventional section, but even it would need to account for the arch's overhang. Henrik calculated that the stone extended far enough forward that the front wall would be entirely in shadow at all times, protected from direct rain and snow. The roof was where conventional wisdom became irrelevant. Standard cabin roofs required substantial structure to support weight of snow and shed water. Henrik's roof would bear no snow load. The stone arch above would catch and hold snow, protecting the cabin beneath. His roof needed only to create an interior ceiling and allow smoke from the fireplace to reach the stone surface where it could transfer heat efficiently. He sketched a design showing a flat ceiling of planks laid across support beams, positioned approximately 1 foot below the stone arch's underside. The gap would allow smoke and heat to circulate against the stone, maximizing heat transfer, while the plank ceiling would create a defined interior space. He would need to calculate chimney placement carefully to ensure smoke could escape, while heat remained trapped against the stone. The fireplace location was critical. Henrik planned to center his fireplace in the back third of the cabin, positioning it to heat the stone arch directly overhead. The chimney would rise vertically to the stone, then angle out from beneath the arch to disperse smoke. The arrangement would be unconventional, but would maximize heat transfer to the geological formation overhead. He calculated materials needed, approximately 80 logs for walls, selected for uniformity and stripped of bark. 2,000 pounds of stone for foundation and fireplace. Clay for chinking and mortar, harvested from the creek bank. Wooden planks for ceiling and floor, hewn from straight-grained pine. His carpentry tools would suffice for the work. By late August, Henrik had finalized his plans and begun mentioning his intentions to other trappers he encountered. The reactions ranged from skepticism to outright mockery. But Henrik had expected nothing different. He was proposing to build in a manner that violated every convention of frontier construction. The first direct confrontation came in early September at the trading post, where trappers gathered to sell pelts and purchase supplies. Henrik was loading pack mules with materials when Jacob Reinhardt, a German trapper who had worked the territory for 15 years, approached with 3 other men. Jacob was respected in the community, known for survival skills and practical knowledge that had kept him alive when younger men had died. "Stromberg," Jacob said, his accent still heavy despite years speaking English. "We hear you plan to build under rocks like some animal. This is true?" The question was not hostile exactly, but it carried weight. The other trappers waited for Henrik's response, their expressions suggesting they had already formed opinions. Henrik continued loading his mules. "I'm building beneath a stone arch 8 miles up the North Valley. The structure will be a conventional cabin, just positioned to take advantage of the geological formation overhead." He kept his tone neutral, factual, refusing to sound defensive. "You think rocks will keep you warm?" This from Thomas McCarty, an Irish trapper who had arrived 2 years earlier. "Or you think you are a bear who needs a cave?" The other men laughed. The comparison to animals living in caves was obvious and had probably been made multiple times already. Henrik turned to face them directly. "Stone absorbs heat and radiates it slowly over time. A cabin built beneath a stone arch will retain heat more efficiently than a freestanding structure. I've done measurements. The principle is sound." He spoke with more confidence than he felt. His measurements had been limited to summer conditions. He was extrapolating to winter, based on theoretical principles, not proven results. Jacob shook his head slowly. "And when the rock falls on you while you sleep? These formations, they shift. They crack in the freeze. You will be crushed, yeah?" This concern had substance. Rock formations did occasionally collapse, though the arch Henrik had selected showed no signs of instability. Still, the risk existed. "The arch has stood for thousands of years," Henrik replied. "The stone shows no cracks or fracture patterns. It's stable." He could not guarantee this with certainty, but geological time suggested the formation was solid. "You are building this because of William's children," Jacob said quietly. The statement was not a question. "This is grief talking, not sense. A normal cabin with a good fire keeps a man alive. What happened to those children? That was terrible cold. Once in 20 years, maybe. You cannot build for the impossible winter." Henrik felt anger rise, but kept it controlled. "I'm building for the impossible winter because the impossible winter will come again. Maybe not this year or next year, but it will come. And when it does, I intend to survive it." He finished securing his load and prepared to leave. "He goes to live in a cave," Thomas said to the others as Henrik led his mules away. "Next spring, we will find him crushed under his rock, and we will say we warned him." More laughter followed Henrik as he left the trading post. He did not look back. Over the following weeks, as Henrik began construction, other trappers made excuses to visit the site. They wanted to see the crazy Swede building his cave cabin. Most offered unsolicited advice that amounted to suggestions he abandon the project and build normally. Henrik began construction on September 12, 1835, working alone in the sheltered space beneath the stone arch. The first task was excavation, removing 18 inches of soil and organic material to reach solid substrate. He dug with a shovel and mattock, hauling the excavated material away in a wooden bucket. The confined space made the work awkward. He could not swing tools freely or maneuver easily. Every movement required awareness of the stone overhead and the limited clearance. The excavation took 11 days of steady labor. When he finished, he had a level rectangular depression 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide, the floor smooth bedrock in some areas and packed mineral soil in others. He began laying foundation stones, selecting flat pieces from a nearby talus slope and fitting them together to create a level surface. The foundation work was meticulous and slow. Each stone required careful placement and checking with a level he had brought from his previous cabin. By early October, the foundation was complete, and Henrik began cutting logs for the walls. He selected standing dead pines, trees that had died recently enough that the wood remained sound but had dried sufficiently to reduce weight. He wanted logs of uniform diameter, approximately 10 inches, and as straight as possible. Each acceptable tree required evaluation, cutting, limbing, and transport to the building site. The work consumed 3 weeks. The wall construction presented unique challenges. The back wall needed to fit against the irregular hillside surface. Henrik used a technique he had learned from his father, scribing the irregular stone surface onto the ends of logs using a compass tool, then trimming the logs to match the contour. The process was time-intensive, but created tight contact between wood and stone, eliminating gaps where cold air could penetrate. The side walls extended forward from the hillside, their top edges following the downward curve of the stone arch overhead. Henrik had to trim each log to a slightly different length and angle to maintain contact with the stone ceiling while keeping the wall vertical. The geometry was complex, requiring constant measurement and adjustment. He worked with a hand level, a measuring cord marked in feet and inches, and careful observation. The front wall was simplest, built conventionally with notched corners and uniform log lengths. Henrik included spaces for a door and 2 small windows, framing these openings with extra support logs. The wall rose to 8 feet at its peak, just clearing his head with comfortable margin. Above this height, the stone arch took over, eliminating need for gable construction or roof support. By late November, the walls were complete. Henrik chinked the gaps between logs with clay mixed with grass and small stones, creating a seal that was flexible enough to accommodate wood movement but dense enough to block air infiltration. He worked the chinking deep into each gap, packing it tight with a wooden tool shaped for the purpose. The interior began to feel enclosed, protected, fundamentally different from the open construction site it had been weeks earlier. December brought snow and dropping temperatures that made construction more difficult, but also more urgent. Henrik needed shelter before the deep cold arrived. He turned his attention to the ceiling, the critical interface between his cabin and the stone arch overhead. The design required precision. Too close to the stone and smoke would not circulate properly, too far, and he would lose the thermal benefit of the geological formation. He installed support beams running perpendicular to the front wall, notching them into the logs and extending them back to rest on stone ledges he had chiseled into the hillside. The beams were spaced 3 feet apart, substantial enough to support the ceiling planks and their own weight without sagging. Each beam required individual fitting since the stone arch curved irregularly overhead. The ceiling planks were hewn from straight-grained pine, shaped with a broad axe and smoothed with a hand plane. Henrik fitted them tightly together across the support beams, creating a flat surface approximately 10 inches below the stone arch at the front of the cabin and 14 inches below at the back, following the arch's natural curve. The gap between ceiling and stone created the circulation space where smoke and heat would transfer to the rock. The fireplace construction demanded his most careful work. He positioned it in the back third of the cabin, centered on the side-to-side axis. The firebox was built from flat stones mortared with clay, sized to burn logs up to 3 feet long. The chimney rose vertically from the firebox to the ceiling, then transitioned to a horizontal section that ran along the space between ceiling and stone, extending toward the front of the cabin before angling upward and out from beneath the arch. The horizontal chimney section was deliberate design. Smoke would travel along this section, heating the stone arch directly before exiting. The arrangement maximized heat transfer from combustion gases to the geological formation overhead. Henrik built the horizontal section from thin, flat stones, creating a flue approximately 8 inches square that would draw adequately while maintaining close contact with the stone above. The door was heavy pine planks held together with cross braces and hung on iron hinges Henrik had purchased at the trading post. The windows were small, covered with oiled paper that admitted light while providing minimal insulation. Henrik knew the windows were thermal weak points, but accepted this compromise for ventilation and visibility. He could cover them with wooden shutters from inside during the coldest weather. By December 20th, the cabin was enclosed and functional. Henrik moved his supplies from his old cabin, making multiple trips through snow that was now knee-deep in the valleys. He built his first fire in the new fireplace on December 22nd, watching carefully as smoke rose through the chimney, traveled along the horizontal section, and eventually found its way out from beneath the stone arch. The draw was adequate. The smoke dispersed without backdrafting into the living space. That first night, with a moderate fire burning, Henrik took temperature measurements. Outside air temperature 18 degrees. Interior cabin temperature near the fire 56 degrees. Interior temperature at the front wall farthest from the fire 48 degrees. The entire space was noticeably warmer than outside, and the heat distribution was more even than in conventional cabins he had experienced. Henrik spent the winter of 1835 to 1836 alone in his stone arch cabin, working his trap lines and recording temperature measurements with methodical regularity. He had purchased a mercury thermometer in St. Louis the previous spring, spending more money than was sensible for an instrument most trappers considered unnecessary. The thermometer became the objective measure of whether his unconventional construction achieved its intended purpose. He established a measurement routine. 3 times daily at dawn, midday, and dusk, he recorded 4 temperatures. Outside air measured 20 feet from the cabin in open shade. Interior temperature near the fireplace. Interior temperature at the front wall opposite the fireplace. Temperature of the stone arch surface, measured by holding the thermometer against the rock overhead for 2 minutes until the reading stabilized. The data accumulated in a journal he kept on a shelf near his bed. Each entry included date, time, weather conditions, fire status, and the 4 temperature readings. Henrik was not trained in scientific method, but he understood that patterns required consistent measurement over time. He never skipped a reading, even when trap lines demanded early departure or late return. January brought the first significant cold, temperatures dropping below zero for sustained periods. Henrik observed patterns that conventional cabin dwellers never noticed. When he built up his fire before bed, the flames heated the interior air quickly. That air rose to the ceiling, then transferred heat to the stone arch overhead. The stone absorbed this heat slowly, its massive thermal mass requiring hours to warm significantly. After the fire died down during the night, conventional wisdom suggested the cabin would cool rapidly. Instead, Henrik woke to temperatures that had dropped only moderately. The stone arch, heated during the evening, radiated warmth back into the living space throughout the night. The release was gradual and steady, maintaining livable temperatures even when the fire reduced to coals. He documented a specific example on January 19th. Evening fire built up at 7 o'clock. Interior temperature near fire, 64 degrees. Stone arch temperature 52 degrees, outside temperature -6 degrees. Fire allowed to die to coals by 10 o'clock. At 2 in the morning, Henrik woke and measured again. Interior temperature near old fire 46 degrees. Stone arch temperature 48 degrees. Outside temperature -8 degrees. The stone had released stored heat, keeping the interior 34 degrees warmer than outside air. The pattern repeated throughout January and into February. The stone arch functioned exactly as Henrik had theorized, acting as a thermal battery that absorbed heat during active fire periods and released it gradually during hours between fires. The massive rock formation overhead contained enough thermal mass that even modest heat input created measurable warming effects that persisted for hours. Henrik compared his experience to memories of his previous conventional cabin. In that structure, he had needed to maintain active fire throughout the night to prevent freezing. Here, beneath the stone arch, he could let the fire die to coals and sleep comfortably, knowing the heated stone would maintain adequate temperature until morning when he could rebuild the fire. February of 1836 brought Henrik deeper understanding of the thermal dynamics at work above his head. The stone arch was not simply a passive insulator or heat reflector. It functioned as an active thermal system, breathing in heat during fire periods and exhaling it back during cold periods. The process was slow, measured in hours rather than minutes, but relentless and predictable. Henrik noticed the phenomenon most clearly during multi-day cold snaps when outside temperatures remained below zero continuously. He would build a fire in the morning, moderate in size, burning it for 3 to 4 hours while he prepared breakfast and organized his day. The fire heated the interior air to comfortable levels, typically 50 to 60 degrees. That warm air rose to the ceiling and pressed against the stone overhead. The stone's surface temperature climbed slowly during these fire periods. Henrik measured it obsessively, checking every hour. The rock would start at perhaps 35 degrees before the fire. After 1 hour of burning, the surface temperature might reach 40 degrees. After 2 hours, 45 degrees. After 3 hours, 50 degrees. The progression was steady but gradual, reflecting the massive thermal inertia of tons of granite overhead. When Henrik let the fire die and left the cabin to check trap lines, the thermal exchange reversed. The heated stone, now warmer than the air below it, began radiating energy downward. Infrared radiation, though Henrik did not know that term, transferred heat from the rock surface to the cabin interior. The air temperature dropped, but far more slowly than it would have in a conventional cabin where heat escaped directly through the roof into the sky. He documented a telling comparison on February 9th. Morning fire burned from 6 until 10 o'clock, heating interior to 58 degrees and stone surface to 49 degrees. Fire extinguished at 10. Henrik departed for trap lines. Return at 4 in the afternoon, 6 hours later. Outside temperature -4 degrees. Interior temperature 38 degrees. Stone surface temperature 41 degrees. The cabin had cooled 20 degrees in 6 hours with no fire, while outside temperature had been -4 the entire time. Henrik calculated that a conventional cabin would have cooled to near outside temperature in the same period. His old cabin, he remembered clearly, would drop from 50 degrees to near zero in 3 hours without fire. The stone arch had reduced the cooling rate dramatically, extending the period between necessary fires and reducing the total wood consumption needed to maintain survivable temperatures. The efficiency impressed him most. He was burning perhaps 60% of the firewood he had consumed in his previous cabin, despite maintaining warmer average temperatures. The stone was doing work that would otherwise require constant fire. Each unit of heat produced by burning wood was being stored, slowly released, and effectively used rather than immediately lost to the atmosphere. By late February, Henrik had accumulated enough data to see clear patterns. The stone arch system worked best during sustained cold periods when the thermal battery effect could cycle repeatedly. It worked adequately during moderate weather when heat storage mattered less. The system's advantages scaled with severity of conditions, becoming most valuable precisely when survival depended on heat retention. March brought moderating temperatures and the return of trappers from winter isolation. Henrik encountered Jacob Reinhardt at a creek confluence in mid-March while both were checking early spring trap sets. Jacob approached with the cautious friendliness of men who had not seen other humans in months. They exchanged basic information about winter survival, trap success, and general conditions before Jacob raised the inevitable question. "Your rock cave kept you alive then?" Jacob's tone suggested he had expected to find Henrik dead or abandoned from the location. The fact that Henrik appeared healthy and well-fed clearly surprised him. Henrik nodded. "The cabin performed better than my previous shelter, warmer with less firewood burned. The stone overhead stores heat and releases it gradually. I have measurements if you want to see the data." He pulled his journal from his pack and opened it to pages of temperature recordings. Jacob examined the numbers with skepticism. "You measured all winter, every day?" The dedication seemed excessive to a man who judged conditions by feel and experience rather than instruments and records. "3 times daily. Outside air, interior air, stone surface temperature. The pattern is consistent. The stone absorbs heat when the fire burns and radiates it back when the fire dies. The cabin stays warmer longer with less fuel." Henrik kept his explanation simple, factual, avoiding any tone of superiority or vindication. Jacob studied the journal pages, his finger tracing columns of numbers he only partially understood. "And you did not freeze? Even in January when we had the deep cold?" The question carried genuine curiosity now, rather than mockery. "I was comfortable. I let the fire die at night, and woke to temperatures above freezing inside. My old cabin would have been below zero in the same conditions." Henrik took the journal back and returned it to his pack. "Other men will not believe this," Jacob said slowly. "They will say you write false numbers, or that you measured wrong. Building under a rock, it is too strange. Men do not trust strange things." He was stating observation, not criticism. Henrik had expected this resistance. "The cabin exists. Any man can visit and see how it's built. Next winter, anyone who wants can take their own measurements. I'm not asking anyone to believe numbers. I'm describing what I observed." He kept his voice neutral, refusing to argue or persuade. Jacob was quiet for a moment, looking at Henrik with reassessment. "You built this because of William's children. This is still about them, yes?" The question was gentler than it might have been. "I built it because I wanted to survive the next extreme winter. William's children showed me that conventional cabins have limits. I found a way to extend those limits." Henrik stated this without emotion, though the memory of Anna and Thomas remained vivid. They parted cordially, each returning to their trap lines. Over the following weeks, Henrik encountered other trappers and had similar conversations. Most were skeptical. Some were curious. None immediately decided to build arch cabins themselves. Henrik had not expected different. Frontier innovations spread slowly, adopted only when necessity or dramatic proof overcame inherent conservatism. The years from 1836 to 1840 passed in cycles of trapping, building maintenance, and continuous refinement of Henrik's understanding. He lived alone in the stone arch cabin, his social contact limited to occasional encounters with other trappers and annual trips to trading posts for supplies. The isolation suited him. It provided time to observe, measure, and improve his shelter's thermal performance. He made modifications based on experience. The first winter revealed that cold air infiltrated through small gaps in the chinking. Henrik addressed this by applying additional clay mixed with horsehair, a technique he learned from a French trapper who had worked in Canada. The horsehair reinforced the clay, preventing cracking during freeze-thaw cycles. The improved chinking reduced drafts significantly. The fireplace required adjustment. The original chimney design drew adequately but could be optimized. Henrik modified the horizontal section, adding a slight upward slope that improved draw while maintaining maximum contact with the stone overhead. He also built a damper system using a flat stone on an iron rod, allowing him to control airflow and extend burn times. Window coverings evolved through experimentation. The oiled paper admitted light, but provided minimal insulation. Henrik constructed interior shutters from thick planks, hinged to swing closed during the coldest nights. With shutters closed, the cabin retained heat noticeably better, though the darkness required adjustment. He burned candles sparingly, measuring their cost against the value of light. Each winter added data to his journals. By 1840, he had 5 years of temperature measurements, filling 3 notebooks with numbers that documented the stone arch's thermal behavior across varying conditions. The data showed consistent patterns. Extreme cold produced the most dramatic advantages. Moderate cold still showed benefits, but less pronounced. The stone arch system's value increased precisely when survival margins narrowed. Henrik shared his findings with trappers who showed interest. A few visited the cabin and examined the construction with genuine curiosity. Most remained skeptical, unable to overcome the strangeness of building beneath rock. The technique required finding appropriate geological formations, a constraint that limited where it could be applied. Most trappers preferred conventional methods that worked anywhere over superior methods that required specific terrain features. 2 trappers did attempt arch-style construction during this period. One found a smaller overhang and built a cramped shelter that provided modest benefits. The other selected an unstable formation that collapsed during construction, reinforcing community skepticism about the entire approach. Henrik could not control how others applied his techniques or what conclusions they drew from partial attempts. He continued trapping successfully enough to sustain himself. The fur trade continued its slow decline, but Henrik's needs were modest, and his trapline knowledge was extensive. He saved money in small amounts, storing coins in a wooden box beneath his sleeping platform. He had no clear plan for the future beyond surviving each winter and maintaining his independence. The stone arch cabin required minimal maintenance. Unlike conventional cabins that needed regular chinking repair and roof replacement, Henrik's structure remained solid. The stone overhead was permanent. The walls settled slightly during the first year, then stabilized. His primary maintenance involved replacing worn door hinges and occasionally refreshing the clay chinking. The winter of 1840 to 1841 announced itself in early November with temperatures that dropped faster and further than any pattern Henrik had recorded in 5 years of measurements. By mid-November, conditions that normally arrived in January were already present. Old trappers at the trading post spoke in quiet tones about signs they recognized from the legendary winter of 1820, a season that had killed dozens of men across the northern Rockies. Henrik prepared methodically. He cut and stacked firewood until he had triple his normal supply. He reinforced his cabin's chinking, checked his fireplace for cracks, and inventoried food stores. The stone arch overhead showed no signs of stress or instability, but he examined it carefully anyway, looking for any indication that freeze-thaw cycles might have weakened the formation. The granite remained solid, unchanged from the day he had first discovered it. December brought cold that descended in waves, each one deeper than the last. Henrik's thermometer recorded -15 degrees in early December, -22 degrees by mid-month. Other trappers began abandoning their remote cabins, moving to trading posts or clustered camps where shared fires in proximity to help improve survival odds. Some invited Henrik to join them. He declined politely, confident in his shelter's capability. On December 28th, the temperature dropped to -31 degrees. Henrik's cabin interior, with a moderate fire burning, remained at 41 degrees. He recorded the measurements in his journal, noting that the 42-degree differential was the largest he had yet documented. The stone arch overhead was doing exactly what he had designed it to do, creating a thermal barrier between his living space and the lethal cold outside. January brought conditions that redefined what Henrik understood as survivable weather. The temperature fell to -36 degrees on January 7th, -40 degrees on January 14th. On January 18th, his thermometer could measure no lower. The mercury column contracted into the bulb, indicating temperatures beyond the instrument's range. Henrik estimated -45 degrees based on how quickly exposed metal frosted and how his breath behaved in the air. Inside his cabin, with his usual fire burning, the temperature held at 38 degrees. Not comfortable by normal standards, but survivable with adequate clothing and blankets. Henrik could move around, prepare food, maintain his fire, and sleep without risk of freezing. He used less firewood than he had during milder winters because the stone arch's thermal mass was so effective at these extreme temperatures. News began filtering through the scattered trapping community. Men were dying. A trapper named Douglas Mackenzie froze in his cabin near the Boulder River despite having firewood stacked outside. 2 brothers working the Madison River drainage were found dead in their bunks, their fire burned out, their cabin interior frozen solid. The stories accumulated through January, passed along by the few men hardy or foolish enough to travel in the conditions. Henrik remained in his stone arch cabin, venturing out only for essential firewood gathering and brief trap checks. His thermal measurements continued 3 times daily, documenting conditions that were killing men in conventional shelters across the territory. The stone overhead, warmed by his fire, radiated heat that kept him alive. On January 19, 1841, the morning Henrik stood outside measuring -38 degrees, he knew the moment had arrived to demonstrate what 5 years of solitary observation had proven. Men were dying in cabins that should have protected them. The impossible winter he had warned about, the winter Jacob Reinhardt had dismissed as too rare to build for, was killing trappers across the Montana Territory. Henrik walked to William Porter's old cabin, now occupied by a trapper named David Sullivan and his younger brother Patrick. The Sullivan brothers had arrived from Missouri 2 years earlier, built a conventional cabin on the site where William's family had died, and established successful trap lines. They were competent men, hard workers, survivors of 2 Montana winters, but they were struggling now. David opened the door when Henrik knocked, his face showing the exhaustion of multiple sleepless nights spent maintaining fire. Inside, Patrick sat close to the fireplace, wrapped in blankets despite the flames roaring less than 4 feet away. The interior temperature, Henrik could feel immediately, was barely above freezing, despite the fire-consuming wood at an unsustainable rate. "I brought my thermometer," Henrik said. "I want to show you something, but I need you to measure your cabin temperature first, then come to my place and measure there. Just observation, no judgment." He kept his tone neutral, offering information rather than criticism. David looked at the thermometer, then at his brother. "What's the point? We know it's cold. We're burning everything we have, and it's still cold. That's just how it is in weather like this." His voice carried defeat rather than argument. "It doesn't have to be this cold inside," Henrik said. "Come see." He handed David the thermometer and waited while the reading stabilized. -2 degrees inside the Sullivan cabin, with a large fire burning steadily. David stared at the number, then looked at Henrik with something approaching despair. They walked to Henrik's cabin, all 3 men moving quickly through cold that burned exposed skin in seconds. Henrik opened his door and ushered them inside. The temperature difference was immediately obvious, physical, undeniable. The Sullivan brothers stopped just inside the door, their expressions shifting from skepticism to confusion to understanding. Henrik's fire was smaller than theirs, burning with moderate flames rather than the roaring blaze they maintained. Yet the cabin interior felt warm by comparison to what they had just left. Henrik placed the thermometer on his table and waited for the reading to stabilize. Positive, 42 degrees. Patrick did the arithmetic first. 44 degrees warmer than our cabin, with a smaller fire. He said it quietly, stating fact without embellishment. David walked slowly around the interior, looking at the ceiling, the walls, the fireplace. His eyes kept returning to the stone arch, visible through gaps in the ceiling planks. The rock does this. The rock overhead keeps you warm. The question was genuine, seeking understanding rather than challenging. Henrik explained the principle simply: heat rises. In conventional cabins, it escapes through the roof into the sky. Here it hits stone that absorbs it and radiates it back. The stone acts as storage, holding warmth and releasing it slowly. The massive formation overhead is a thermal battery powered by the fire below. Other men need to know this, David said. Men are dying. If this works, if it really keeps you 44 degrees warmer, others need to know. The Sullivan brothers survived the winter of 1841 by moving into Henrik's cabin. The three men shared the space through February and into March, maintaining fire in shifts and experiencing firsthand how the stone arch system functioned. When temperatures finally moderated in late March, David and Patrick returned to their own cabin, but their understanding of frontier shelter had changed permanently. Word spread through the trapping community without formal announcement or organized effort. Men who had survived the catastrophic winter talked to other survivors. The Sullivan brothers described the 44-degree temperature differential they had witnessed. A few trappers who had previously dismissed Henrik's approach now reconsidered, their skepticism undermined by the winter's death toll and the objective proof of measured temperatures. Henrik did not promote his techniques or seek recognition. When trappers asked questions, he answered factually. When they wanted to see his cabin, he showed them. When they requested specific construction advice, he provided it. But he made no attempt to convince anyone or argue for adoption of arch-style building. The stone arch cabin existed as demonstration. Men could learn from it or ignore it as they chose. The practical challenge was finding suitable geological formations. Stone arches of adequate size were not common. Most trappers worked territories where no appropriate formations existed within reasonable distance of good trapping grounds. The technique could not be universally applied, which limited its spread even among men who recognized its advantages. 3 trappers built arch-style cabins in the summer of 1841. One found an excellent formation similar to Henrik's and constructed a shelter that proved nearly as effective. The second built under a smaller overhang that provided moderate benefits but lacked the thermal mass for extreme conditions. The third attempted construction under an unstable rock face that experienced a minor collapse, destroying weeks of work and reinforcing concerns about building beneath geological formations. By 1843, approximately a dozen arch-style cabins existed across the northern Montana Territory and into what would later become Wyoming. The distribution was scattered, limited to areas where appropriate stone formations coincided with viable trapping grounds. The technique became a known option rather than a standard practice, adopted by men whose territories permitted it and whose personalities favored unconventional solutions. The broader trapping community's response was mixed. Some men respected the innovation and wished they had terrain suitable for replication. Others remained skeptical, attributing Henrik's success to luck or exaggeration. A few continued to mock the approach as strange or cowardly, though such criticism carried less force after the winter that had killed so many men in conventional cabins. Henrik's life continued in familiar patterns. He trapped, maintained his cabin, recorded temperature measurements, and lived with the solitude he had grown to prefer. The stone arch overhead required no maintenance. The walls needed occasional chinking repair, but remained fundamentally sound. His shelter had become permanent in ways that conventional cabins never achieved. The fur trade's decline accelerated through the early 1840s. Beaver populations were depleted, Fashion had shifted away from felt hats. Markets that once paid premium prices now offered minimal returns. Trappers began leaving the mountains, seeking other opportunities or returning to settlements. Henrik continued working his lines, but he recognized that an era was ending. Henrik Stromberg left the Montana Territory in the spring of 1846, 11 years after he had discovered the stone arch and begun construction of the cabin that had defined his adult life. The fur trade had collapsed completely by then, beaver pelts commanding prices that made trapping economically unsustainable. He was 42 years old, unmarried, with savings accumulated from years of modest living and careful management. He had no family ties to the mountains and no reason to remain once the work that had brought him west no longer existed. He traveled to the Oregon Territory, purchased land in the Willamette Valley with money saved from his trapping years, and established a small farm. The transition from mountain solitude to agricultural settlement life was difficult, but Henrik adapted with the same methodical patience he had applied to survival in the wilderness. He married in 1848 a widow named Anna Sorensen, who had emigrated from Denmark and needed help working her deceased husband's land claim. The marriage was practical rather than romantic, a partnership built on shared work and compatible temperaments. They had 2 children, a daughter, born in 1849, and a son in 1851. Henrik rarely spoke about his years in the mountains. His children knew he had been a trapper, but he offered few details about that life. The stone arch cabin, the temperature measurements, the winter that had killed so many men, remained private history that served no purpose in his new circumstances. In the Montana Territory, Henrik's cabin remained standing. A young trapper named James Wilson occupied it from 1847 through 1853, benefiting from the shelter's thermal properties while working trap lines that still produced modest returns. When Wilson left, another man took his place. The cabin became a known landmark, referred to in the scattered trapping community as the Stromberg Arch or the Stone Cabin. Its location and construction made it valuable to anyone working that drainage. The technique of building beneath stone arches persisted in limited application through the 1850s and into the 60s. New settlers moving west occasionally discovered the advantages when appropriate geological formations existed near their claims. A few guidebooks written for emigrants mentioned arch-style construction as an option for areas with suitable terrain. The innovation never became widespread, constrained by geology and the eventual shift from primitive frontier cabins to more formal homestead construction. Henrik died in 1873 at age 65, buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon. His gravestone listed his name, birth year, death year, and nothing else. His children inherited the farm and knew their father as a quiet man who worked hard, spoke little, and seemed comfortable with silence. They never learned about the cabin in Montana or the winter that had validated 5 years of obsessive measurement and unconventional thinking. The stone arch in Montana remained unchanged, weathering decades without collapse or significant degradation. The cabin beneath it stood until sometime in the early 1880s when the logs finally rotted beyond use. But even after the structure disappeared, the arch itself remained visible, a geological formation that had once kept a man 44 degrees warmer than his neighbors and demonstrated that innovation often came from observing what nature had already built.